This is a milestone. It's the 50th anniversary of the cessation of ground combat in Vietnam. So the U.S. was pretty much out from a ground combat standpoint 50 years ago. Not exactly today, it was over a period of time. So we thought this was the appropriate moment to recognize this milestone and the really incredible sacrifices that so many made during the war. There are 5 of us tonight who will share pictures and stories from our service. I'm Ron Beck, and I'm joined by Kermit Birchfield, Bob Griffith, Robert Williams, and Rob Russell. We were all in our early 20s when we served in Vietnam, so you have to go in the Wayback Machine to figure where we were coming from. We were basically young and invincible at the time. We offer some observations from our individual experiences in the Vietnam War, but we recognize that we, and perhaps nobody else, really knew what was going on in total. It happened over so many years in so many places with so many different segments fighting that it's hard to have a comprehensive view of what went on. Before we really go any further, I want to take just a moment to thank the people who made this happen for us. Holly Clay, who's in the front row, deserves a lot of credit for her effort. Not only in putting together the exhibit in the firehouse, but for getting the speakers together. And I'm sure it was like herding cats because it couldn't have been that easy. But you were persistent and it worked. Sandra Williams helped with publicity, and we thank you for that. And Louisa Cassidy offered some speaking tips for us that were well received. And I also want to recognize the help we got from the Annisquam Historical Committee, the Village Library. Vietnam wasn't one thing. It was a very geographically diverse country with 2,000 miles of coastline. And when you start at the north, the Bac Sang Valley, very mountainous and beautiful region, and then headed down to the Khe Mau Peninsula, it was rice paddies and very flat. So in between, there were all sorts of terrains. I'm going to use this as a orientation. I know you can't read the individual areas, but I'm just going to point to a few things to get you oriented to where we were and what we did. The Gulf of Tonkin is right here, and adjacent to it is Haiphong Harbor and Hanoi. And then as you go further down, the demilitarized zone is right here, and a little bit further down is Da Nang, and then Central Highlands, and then here is Bien Hoa and Saigon. And then the Mekong River has several mouths, so this is called the mouths of the Mekong. And then you go all the way around to the Cambodian border and the Khe Mau Peninsula. I want to point where the laser is. There's a little village called Sonendok, and I'll show you some pictures from a beautiful little fishing village. The other thing you would note here is these buff-colored lines coming down are the communist supply routes. So if you look at this sea route in red, that was what the Navy and the Coast Guard was set to stop all of the contraband coming down that route. And once that was choked off, they still had what was called Ho Chi Minh Trail. And some of the other speakers will talk about that, but Ho Chi Minh Trail was an amazing amount of goods that came through that, even though we were bombing it very heavily. And almost no one got to see the whole country. The experiences were certainly different for everyone serving, because where you served, when you served, and what your missions were depended on what the experience was. So there's 5 different experiences here tonight that will be presented. I was a Coast Guard officer on coastal patrols, Da Nang to the south. Bob Griffiths was an armored cavalry platoon leader in central Vietnam. And Robert Williams was a Marine combat artist and infantryman serving in central Vietnam. Kermit Birchfield, Air Force pilot, flying missions throughout Vietnam and Laos. And Rob Russell, Army medical doctor in central Vietnam. And we were there from 66 to 70, basically. The war went on before and after, but that was basically the time period that we were there. I'm going to speak a little bit about the Coast Guard's role in Vietnam. The area of operations that I was involved with went from the Cambodian border around Khe Mau Peninsula all the way up to Da Nang, and we effectively squeezed off any ocean supply routes for contraband in that area. My perspective was wet behind the ears ensign, fresh graduate from the Coast Guard Academy, on a ship that was much older than I was. 1936 it was built, and we were mostly offshore patrolling that area that you just saw in red, but I was young, invincible, and eager to go in country, so I did so as much as I possibly could. And then I got to sail along the entire coast of Vietnam on a Navy ship headed back to Subic Bay. So I get the question, what the heck was the Coast Guard doing in Vietnam? And the short answer is the Navy didn't have any patrol boats that could get into the shallow waters, like in the Mekong River area. So the Coast Guard deck loaded a number of 82-foot patrol craft and took the patrol craft and their crews over to Vietnam. Russ Smith was one of the captains of the 82-footer that went over in that first group. And the other story I like to tell about what the Coast Guard was doing there. Coast Guard predates the Navy by 8 years. 1790, the Navy was formed in 1798. So the Coast Guard's been involved in every war since the quasi-war with France in 1798. So it was natural that we would be there. I had to get in the dig for the Navy. The mission areas that we were involved with on the Coast Guard cutter Bibb, my ship, were Operation Sea Lords, which I'll explain a little bit about, naval gunfire support, Operation Market Time, and we had medical civic action programs, basically clinics in the villages. Operation Sea Lords was designed to disrupt North Vietnamese supply lines and basically patrolling the mouths of the rivers in the southern area first. That was where I spent most of my time. And we also provided support for the Navy swift boats. So after the 82s came over, the Coast Guard boats, swift boats came over. And in this picture, there are 7 PCFs or swift boats that were mothering, and there's an 82-footer in the background. And what we did with them is we rearmed them, refueled them, provided a safe haven where it was far enough offshore so they could get rest and a little bit of downtime. It was a highly successful blockade. We basically stopped everything from coming in there, but it was at a price. You probably can't see it from where you are, but the second boat in is PCF 94. They were all 2-number designations. And if you were up close, you could see there's a lot of bullet holes in the side of the aluminum superstructure. And I took a close look at it as we were going aboard to make repairs. There are 5 antennas that are about the size of your finger, and every single one of them had been hit. So it was very intense fire. This is a gunner's mate getting rid of the spent brass after that mission. And there were 2 wounded, the officer in charge and another gunner's mate. And he was being medevaced by helicopter, and he had a smile on his face because he said, "I'm going home." So we didn't think he was in too much trouble. Something to note, though, this was PCF 94, and if you look up where John Carey served, he was the next officer in charge on this particular PCF. This is an example of the Sea Lord's inspection duty, where we board every junk that we saw and dig underneath the cargo to see if there was any contraband there. Another mission was naval gunfire support. We were able, because of a little less draft and a bigger gun, we could get in closer, and we actually moved some of the Vietcong storage dumps, ammunition dumps, back further because we had more range than the first Navy ships that came in there. We also provided support for troops in something called harassment and interdiction fire. And here's a picture of a spotting round of white phosphorus. So this is what we were seeing that we were shooting at. As far as I could tell, most times we were blowing up a lot of trees. Operation Market Time was established after the Tonkin Gulf incident, and it was a blockade of the entire South Vietnamese coast. And that was very effective because these ships were big, slow-moving targets, and if they wouldn't stop, we made them stop. So it essentially shut down that first route that I showed you. And the 4th program that mission that we had with these medical civic action programs, basically pop-up clinics in little villages. It was a goodwill effort, and we provided outpatient medical care, medicines, but we couldn't really come back the next day or the next week. So it was frustrating that the effectiveness of it was not as great as it would have been if there were permanent South Vietnamese doctors there. But the bad side of that is doctors and teachers had a bounty on their heads, so they weren't sticking around these villages, which was really kind of sad. In this particular picture, this Dr. John Gillette was trying to get some plastic surgery for a girl who had been hit by shrapnel. And the clinic would deal with infections. This is a bad skin infection. Kids would mug up for, they'd come to these clinics just to see what was going on, even if they weren't sick, and they always mugged for the camera. This is an interesting pose that I saw a number of times. The eldest daughter had to normally carry the youngest or one of the younger children on her hip. In lieu of a stroller or something like that. And you might notice that this is a little boy, and there's no diaper there, so she had to be really quick in turning the baby when she started to feel something wet and warm. This is Songandok, I mentioned, in the west coast of the Kei-Mau Peninsula. This was a little fishing village that the Coast Guard became very adoptive of. There's shrimp drying along the main drag here, and it was isolated in that it was there was no way to get there except by boat. The Coast Guard also helped repair and paint the local school, and I suspect there was some alcohol involved here by looking at the paint job. But we were happy to do what we could. And the Coast Guard made this swing. They didn't have a good sense of what footings were needed for it, so it's disappearing into the mud. But the kids still enjoyed it. And I don't want you to think that it was all fun and games. Behind them is an observation tower, and right behind that is a row of trees. And every single night, mortars would be fired from that tree line into the village. So you'd have to get into bunkers, and there were a lot of casualties from that. So these kids were definitely children of war. And the last picture here is of two kids in Sonnedock playing in front of their hut. And one of my lasting memories of Vietnam is the little girl in this picture who was just adorable. She was about 5 years old. Came up to me around supper time with a rice bowl and a tiny little chicken wing in it, and she handed it to me. And I have not been back to Vietnam, but if I do go back, this is one place I'd like to go. I'd like to try to find her. I figure she's roughly 65 or so. She may still be there. So next up, if I can get in here. Bob Griffiths is going to talk about his operations. And
He was assigned to the 3rd Squadron, 5th Cavalry in June of 1968. I rode with the 5th for the year 68 and 69. Prior to that, I'd been assigned to the 6th Armored Cavalry Regiment, actually in at Fort Meade, Maryland.
Can everybody hear him? No, you might have to use
Okay. Is this better?
Right, up the camera.
Okay.
Yeah.
In February of '68, the 6th Cavalry was alerted to move to Vietnam when Westmoreland asked for 200,000 additional troops. That was denied, and I rotated in June of '68 to the 5th Cavalry. A ground cavalry regiment, a squadron, consisted of 3 troops. Each troop having 3 platoons and a headquarters platoon. And the platoon consisted of about 40 men, 3 tanks, 6 armored cavalry assault vehicles, which were modified troop carriers, and a mortar carrier, and an infantry carrier. It was something of a small combined arms team. And our typical mission would be road security, base security, support for engineers who were doing clearing work in this case out of north of Hue, where the Tet offensive had taken over the city and held it for about 6 weeks, and subsequently executed probably 6,000 of the native local native population. We also would do sweeps of the area. Next slide. Sweeps of the area, and you can see from the map where Wonder Beach is, which is the base camp. In the center, about halfway between the Wonder Beach and Highway 1 was a base camp that we frequently supported and operated out of, keeping the road clear between the Wonder Beach and the Highway 1 area itself. These were not all next. Wonder Beach was not all fun and games, although we got to the beach as frequently as we could, but most of the time we were in the area between the coast and Highway 1. Next. This is a fishing village, a little bit different from the fishing village that Ron experienced. This was literally on the beach. The fishermen would go out mostly at night and harvest small fish, which they would then take overland to market during the daytime or tend to their vessels. Literally the second day I was there, next slide, we got involved in a battle literally on the beach with the North Vietnamese battalion that was trying to assault our base camp at Wonder Beach. The result was five battalion-sized units, including our squadron, that was able to encircle it and essentially annihilate those folks. When I'd been there about 24 hours, the squadron commander decided I was too new and too green to stay in the battle, so he sent me to the next to the center area on the road between Wonder Beach and the Highway 1. Next, please. And that night we were ambushed. It was literally, again, my first 24 hours as a platoon leader. We lost one vehicle, as you can see. The crew was basically evacuated. Two of them returned. The rest, I couldn't even remember their names. I was so new. We moved on from there to the kinds of missions that we were used to. This is an interior view of one of the ACAS. It's got mostly ammunition on the deck and some personnel equipment, and that's where we lived while we were there. We didn't actually live in camps or in huts or anything like that until later. Next is a view of the Wonder Beach area after one of two typhoons and the results of the seasonal monsoon, which basically flooded us out. By the end of October, we had to evacuate to another base camp at Camp Evans. Again, you can see on the map where Camp Evans is circular. It's in the Piedmont area, and you'll see how the terrain changes very rapidly. The next slide shows an example of us moving out on a contact mission. These are the ACAS. I don't think I need to show you what a tank looks like. But these were modified personnel carriers, and as you can see, they'd been upgunned with a 50 caliber machine gun in the center and two smaller machine guns on the flanks, which gave us a tremendous amount of firepower. Next slide gives you a view of the Piedmont area that we had to negotiate, and it's becoming increasingly difficult for us to move around and maneuver into situations where we could deploy ourselves and fight. This next slide is a picture of Camp Evans. And you can also see the changed terrain. This was where the first place we ever got actually to camp out in tents. And they were 30-man tents, pretty much one for each platoon. And from there, we would then deploy in reaction to various fights. The next three are particularly interesting, I think. This picture and the next two were taken on August 22nd, 1968. The first shows us maneuvering against a North Vietnamese heavy weapons company that we were able to isolate and eventually annihilate, with the exception of 2 or 3 POWs. The second slide, that's an example of some of the equipment, or the North Vietnamese equipment that we captured, and the next one of a North Vietnamese POW. And you can see from this that he's already being treated by our medics. And at least for us, us combatants, once the fight was over, these guys were not considered a threat. We took care of them as well as we could, as well as we did for our own people. The last 2 slides, you can see Camp Evans and south to Hue are taken into the interior. The first is an example of the terrain between Hue and Da Nang, where the mountains literally came down to the coast, and we couldn't really get through them. Had to go over them. Today, by the way, there's a 4-lane highway that goes under the mountain, and all of that area is not. It's scenic, but not so much of an obstacle. Finally, I want to show you fire support base Blaze on the edge of the Ashaw Valley. This was the last place that I spent any time at. Our operation was in support of 101st Airborne Division operation that resulted in the Battle of Hamburger Hill. Our mission at the time was to assist the engineers in pushing our way through the highway, opening up the highway between Hue and the Ashaw Valley. Again, another example. Today it is a 4-lane highway, and it joins just a little further east of Fire Support Base Blaze with the highway that runs from North Vietnam south to South Vietnam through what was then South Vietnam. Again, a 4-lane highway, and not inappropriately known as the Ho Chi Minh Highway. I want to reiterate a couple of things that Ron started out with. I consider this a remembrance more than a celebration. There were a total of 58,212 men killed in Vietnam, Americans, 8 women, a total of 66,000 40 South Vietnamese. I'm sorry, I got that wrong. South Vietnamese, 55,661. North Vietnamese, 1,120,000 North Vietnamese. For me, one of the enduring questions in my mind is how much better off any of them would have been had the war not occurred. You can go to Vietnam today, and I've been there, and see the North Vietnamese graveyards. They're very reminiscent of the graveyards in France from World War I, especially. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
It's good to see everyone here tonight, despite this inclement weather. And it's way after 7, which means I would be snoring by now. However, Sandy, my wife, of 50 years, has helped me through a lot of hard times.
I think you got it.
Oh? Okay, good. Each of us who are here tonight, as far as military, has a distinctive and characteristic story to tell. And mine, in some respects, is similar, and in many respects, it's unique. I'll probably talk more about the unique part, being a combat artist, Marine combat artist. And I usually tell everybody when I was in Vietnam, I had a sketch pad in one hand, arm, and a rifle in the other. And we could start out. This is a fun slide. This is going to be at the lighter side of the war, especially this first slide. This is the Da Nang Press Center, and that was the center for all of Vietnam's military actions, all the information regarding firefights and what was important at that time was filtered through the Da Nang Press Center. And it also was regarded as the Combat Information Bureau, which is CIB. And Sadie couldn't figure out why the motto for CIB was last to know, first to go. And she said, how could that be? So I let her go on and on. But anyway, this is the distinctive front gate to the Da Nang Press Center. And that gentleman on the far right, you can see, that's Shorty the gate guard, top security. That's supposed to be funny. He, however, was one of the most decorated Vietnam soldiers in the war. And they were both the younger guy and taller, and Shorty the gate guard were very upstanding. And one thing I learned about being among the Vietnamese people, how genuine and authentic and well-meaning people I've met. Okay. This is our renegade group of drummers, or combat artists. This is taken in front of our studio tonight. We had just, each of us had gone out to different units, covered whatever vestige of war we were going to manage observing. And there's Gary Moss to the left holding his comic going down, and next to him standing, if we grin, is Scott Green, and he has since passed away. In the middle is the Ben Long, who was an officer in charge of at that time, but he didn't act like an officer. They were just all the same as far as producing artists. And then Dave Anderson holding the Strathmore pad, which is a whole story in itself, how the Strathmore logo got there and how his photograph was taken. And then myself with the sombrero, and we had just gotten back from a trip. And one thing too about the Denang Press Center, or the Combat Information Bureau, is that all the press that you saw on TV, the press personnel came through there. And actually, part of our responsibility as combat artists or as Marines in that compound was to take whatever film that was taken in the field by the different reporters. We, around midnight, took turns driving, taking the Jeep to the airport, at which time a Learjet coasted in, didn't shut off, it just coasted. We drove up to the porthole of the Learjet, threw the bag of film, and it was off to Japan for a filter, for processing. Okay. This is just we were pretty much privileged to go anywhere we wanted. In other words, a lot of military had to sign forms and permission slips and things to go to different places. But especially in Penang, where I had the opportunity to photograph what I thought had some artistic merit and showed this young man, his name is Gogo. That's the only name I knew as Gogo. He did odd jobs around the compound. I guess I looked at him as my baby brother. He's a very respectful and talented young man. And I had him come in to the studio, which he loved. And he did several drawings during his lunchtime. And this is one of them. And it's a firefight with, it says, with a VC in the bottom, it says, I want Chu-Hoi. Chu-Hoi means I want to surrender. Next one. Just a typical street scene. Okay, next. An area adjacent to in Penang is a place called Marble Mountain. And for centuries, marble was harvested. In this case, some smaller pieces were chiseled out as far as made into little Buddhas and elephants and sold as curiosities for sale. Next. This is some strange guy we picked up along the way. And most of the time I was in an area south of Penang, in an area called Arizona Territory. And in Arizona Territory, another distinctive and relative name was Project Operation Range Hand, which happened to be the defoliant. And I spent a lot of my time there. Another group. We had very mixed racial group. We had one guy from Hawaii, and he was called the Great Kahuna, and he never ate any sea rations. He always had bags of roots, I think he found. This is, in that area, we didn't have firefights that often. When we did, they were small, and they were 5-10 minutes to come and go. And at this time, we're waiting for the patrol to come back. This is just, we're waiting for a chopper for these guys to leave for a little in-country run. While out in the countryside, the civilians were caught in between not only the two different armies, but their own survival. This is a typical street scene out in the countryside. And this young lady kind of, it describes itself, the tenderness and the grace in which she has her finger on her lip, and not to mention the inquisitive nature of that smile. This is one photograph in Way, and in fall of '69, there was information came to our compound, and they discovered 300 graves, mass grave. There was over 300 individuals there, and I covered that as a combat artist. Okay. Knowing that the audience tonight would be mixed emotions and sensitivities, I chose just to portray or show just a few. Now this woman was looking for her husband among the remains. And you might say, well, how could they identify remains that are over a year old? The University of Way kept dental records of many of the victims. And the victims, this woman and her daughter finally found and identified the remains of this, and that's her husband in that bag. Subsequently, a couple weeks later, I went back to cover the funeral, and it's the altar set up and some of the guests. That's a definitive statement done in graphite, self-explanatory. And I hate to leave without showing some of the smiles and some of the hope for the future in Vietnam, if they were wonderful people. This woman was one of the workers at the compound, and we were there celebrating, having a Christmas party, and all the kids of the help got presents. And it's amazing to see all these characters, and like Rob mentioned about the 65-year-old. This is the most poignant one of all my photographs. The look on her face says it all, and I call her the Saigon Bride. Well, sorry about the shake-up. But thank you very much for listening.
I'm at Birchfield. Can you hear me all right?
No.
Yes. No? More?
Just a little closer.
Closer?
Yes.
Now?
Yes.
Okay. I want to give you a little background before we go, and that's that I served in the Air Force from 1959 to 1967. I went through a program called Aviation Cadets when I was 19 years old, and I got my wings in my commission when I was 20. And I ended up flying 101s, which is a McDonnell product, supersonic, out of Otis Air Force Base. So I did that for the better part of 5 years before I was transferred to a secret squadron in Topeka, Kansas. And when I got to Topeka, I was amazed that the secret squadron was DC-3s. really quite fast compared to my old planes. The interesting thing is, I heard Ron say tonight that his ship was built in 1936. My DC-3 was 1936. It's pretty amazing. But if you think about it, they flew all over Europe in World War II, dropping parachutists and delivering goods. They flew over in China. They were really, they made a lot of them, and they were a reliable airplane, really reliable. When I got to Topeka, we figured out what was going on. They were going to put side-mounted guns in these DC-3s and shoot when you were doing a slight bank, 30-degree bank angle, to bring a retina sight on line with what you were looking at or what you were targeting. And believe it or not, they'd not done this before, and they wanted to keep it reasonably quiet about what they were doing. The first Puff, which was the code name for the first test aircraft, 2 aircraft in early '65 went to Vietnam, and they were initially repulsed by the Air Force. The Air Force thought that wasn't going to work. Well, when they saw it in action, they decided that they would order more, and that was Topeka. So we left Topeka, got to look carefully here to make sure I'm right. We left Topeka on November 1, '65 to California, then to Hickam Air Force Base, then departed for Midway, to Wake, to Guam, to Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines, and on to Vietnam. Tan Son Nhut was next to Saigon. It was a major airport. The aircraft itself was configured with 3 Gatling guns. And if we can go to, that's a picture of the crew, and you can see the gun, barely see it, but it's there. There are 2 out of the windows and 1 out of the door. And we also carried somewhere around 50 flares that were 2 million candle power. I mean, they were really bright. They were magnesium flares. They would burn for about 3 minutes in a parachute, and they would give you sufficient light to see what you were doing if you knew what you were doing, which many of us didn't. But that's a picture of the gun and the 3 guns. The pilot would have a reticle sight, fixed reticle sight right here in the window. Then you put the aircraft in a 30-degree bank, and you would put in a little top rudder to hold it and go around in a circle, and you could bring the guns to bear. The guns were 3 7.62 Gatling guns. They fired 6,000 rounds per minute. And so you could have 18,000 rounds going out of the guns. A 3-second burst would put roughly 1 bullet every square foot in a football field. It was amazing. So if you go to the next slide, you can see from the inside, we carried 2 gunners that would rearm the weapons, and a crew chief, and 2 pilots. And so the next slide. This is where we ended up flying most of our missions, over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And that's an aerial picture of it from our aircraft. You can see where there's smoke going, where we view the fire, or we were also forward air controllers. We would FAC in fighters like A-1Es or F-4s or 105s or whatever was in the air that had carried bombs. And we would try and interdict trucks on the route or destroy the route so you couldn't go through it. The original purpose of the aircraft was to do strategic hamlets in South Vietnam. No one anticipated that it was going to be moved up into North Vietnam and into Laos. We ended up in Cambodia as well. All of that was classified and you couldn't talk about it. We flew missions into Laos carrying people, and I remember one flight where I put on my khakis and my shirt because we were not to dress military. Couldn't carry our dog tags, couldn't carry any identification, so that we really looked like Laotians. As we came down, you're not going to fool anybody. But we did that, and working with Air America and a number of people like that, all very quiet. And it didn't really come out until about 67, 68. I know that this guy saw us in action, and I think he thought they were okay. It really terrified the Viet Cong rather. The aircraft looked like, if you go to the next one, that's another, again, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. You can see two fighters, but they're hard to see. They're the two black dots, left and right. Okay. Again, this is working just south of North Vietnam, in Laos, not across the border. And the mountains were roughly 10,000 feet or higher. So if we ever lost an engine, we couldn't climb out. We were trapped. And as a result, we lost a number of aircraft that we never knew where they went down. Just they were up there and you couldn't find them. This is this is our tracer fire going down from the gun moments after the gun shut off. And the next one is inside the aircraft looking behind the gun, and you can see the trail of fire, and that's how you got the nickname Puff the Magic Dragon. It looked like a dragon. And it was terrifying, actually. Again, this is out of the aircraft, and you can see the lead pursuit on the shells. The tracer every fifth round. And so if you're firing at the rate we were firing, that you could just walk up the tracers. Okay? Again, this is an 01, which I was flying, Ford Air Controller, and we were FACing people in on suspected Vietnamese or North Vietnamese. That's in South Vietnam, up in the I Corps area. Okay. Again, another run with fighters going in. You can see one of the fighters, a black dot, just below the wing of the aircraft. But they would come in with napalm or 500-pound bombs, and they were reasonably effective, not 100% effective, but they could close a road fairly effectively. Again, that's ground fire coming toward us, but you would, up north in Laos, you ran into fairly heavy anti-aircraft. Down south, it wasn't as bad, but it was still bad. But it wasn't big guns. They had really large guns up in North Vietnam and in parts of Laos. And they would do a real number. Okay. That's an A1E. No, that's the wrong one, but that's okay. That's a VNAF, Vietnamese Air Force A1E. It has a bubble canopy, single man, and it carried a lot of armament and bombs, rockets, and so forth. Is the other one on there?
I don't think so. I couldn't find.
Okay. I was looking for the one that I flew, which was basically the same aircraft that had a much larger canopy, and you carried everything in it. You could carry chickens, goats, anything else. And we did. It was amazing. So you could move anything in it. I don't think I have much else except to say that on Bob's slides, he had one or two slides that had Street Without Joy on them. And there's a great book, if you ever want to read it, by Barnard Falls, called Street Without Joy. And it's really the history of where we got to where we got. And unfortunately, he was killed just after I left, like that. Take that. So that's about all I have. I'm happy to be around later if you want to talk about it. Thank you.
I am Ron Russell. I was with the U.S. Army Medical Corps during Vietnam for 1 year. So it was 1965. I was a second-year medical student at Columbia. I was 23 years old. There was a doctor draft going on. And the military came to each medical school to explain a plan called the Berry Plan, which meant that, okay, after medical school you have internship and residency. That the Berry Plan said that, okay, you're going to be drafted probably, but now if you sign up now, you can be drafted in the middle of your training or at the end of your training. So in other words, halfway through your training or at the very end of it. So, in 1965, everyone thought, well, that's going to be 4 years from now. Surely this war is going to be over. So about 2/3 of students signed up, including myself, for it, thinking that it's going to keep going on. But when I graduated from medical school in 1967, 2 years later, the Tet Offensive was beginning, and when, of course, the worst part was in 1968, but it was very clear that the war was not going to be over. So I was inducted into the Army in 1969 and spent 1970, part of 69 and 71 in Vietnam. Please. This is the area that I operated in. I was with the 20th Primitive Medicine Unit, and my job was to evacuate people, medically sick people. These are not people who were war wounds. These were people who were dying of diseases, tropical diseases usually, mostly. The most common one was diarrhea, which I'll explain in a little bit why, because it was like a cholera diarrhea where the dehydration was so profound that you can't keep up with the fluid losses. The other job was to try to prevent soldiers from getting sick by taking malaria prophylaxis and so forth, which there was a problem with because the pills made them sick to the stomach. So it was very hard to get soldiers routinely to take the pill on a daily basis. I sort of used to get sick to my stomach with a chloroquine-primaquine combination. Please. So this is my first day in Vietnam. It was during a monsoon rain, just downpouring. My room was right next to his bunker on the bottom floor, and I was assured that I was very lucky to be right next to the bunker. This is a place, Army base called Long Binh. It was very close to Van Hoa, where a lot of in Long Binh, where a lot of the Tet Offensive took place. And rockets came in routinely to this base, even though it was 2 years after the Tet Offensive. They came in almost nightly. And on this base was the evacuation hospital. So when soldiers were blown up or war wounds or medically sick with, for example, encephalitis, they would come to this base, and I would have to try, my job was to get the medically sick ones back to this base so they could be taken care of in the 93rd Evacuation Hospital. If they were doing well enough at that 90 and stabilized at the 93rd Evacuation Hospital, then these soldiers would be transferred to Japan. And from Japan, if they were well enough, they would be transferred back to the United States. So that's kind of the way it worked at that time. So this is one of the buildings. There are several buildings in the background. You can see on the horizon that are part of the evacuation hospital. These are Army ambulances in the front here. And of course, everything is bunkered well. And this is in the 24th Evacuation Hospital, sort of served the southern part of Vietnam. This is where soldiers came into when they were very badly off with war wounds or with for stabilization or with medical diseases that needed stabilization as well. Please. This is Cholong in Saigon, to show you what the atmosphere was like. Long Binh and Van Hoa are about 20 miles away from Saigon. Next, please. And this is Van Hoa. So Long Binh was between Saigon and Van Hoa. You can see a bridge that had been blown up during the Tet Offensive down in the lower right-hand corner here. And you can see some activity, bombing activities that's going on right up there, sort of midstream. This is the Dong Nai River, which flows into the Saigon River. Next, please. These are 4 doctors, me on the left, in the 20th Preventive Medicine Unit. And 3 of us made out well. 4 doctors did not make it out well. The next slide. Medical evacuations. Why were they done? Most common for me was evacuating people with cholera-like diarrhea. That these men were so dehydrated they couldn't lift their heads off the ground. And if they're in a remote fire-based camp, that means they're totally non-functional, and not only that, they are easy targets for being killed. So they had to be got. We had to take them away and get them back to be resuscitated and put into an evacuation hospital. Another big reason to evacuate people, soldiers, was the tropical diseases of encephalitis, a virus known as Japanese flea virus, or cerebral malaria that had gone into the brain. Other severe infections that I had to evacuate people with and get them safely back was meningitis, plague, bubonic plague, diphtheria, tuberculosis, and of course there were the usual medical things that can happen to soldiers under stress: heart attacks, appendicitis, and traumatic psychosis. All of these people had to be taken back. As for trying to prevent diseases, One of the major ones, of course, was venereal disease. And to get soldiers into the habit of using sun protection. Malaria control, I talked about that already, taking the prophylactic pills that made them sick. And then, of course, the diarrhea control, trying them not to eat in village shacks and village side little cafes and so forth, because it's just dirty. It's just very, very dirty. In fact, the Army always said that ice cubes in a drink were like fresh frozen hepatitis. Please. So this is a street. This is actually Canton in the Delta. But you can see why malaria control and mosquito-borne diseases that breed in these puddles during the rainy seasons, which are twice a year, big rainy seasons twice a year, happen. And you can also see the filth in the street. Basically, a lot of the streets were like open sewers. Slide, please. Next. And this is the Saigon River. And you can see the filth in the river. And of course, this is water that's used for everything, including cooking. So that's why I want people not to use food that's in the food stalls along the streets. Next slide. And this is the reason for venereal disease control instruction. All these soldiers are waiting to get into a brothel here in Saigon. Next slide. So now we're going to take you on a trip. This was a radio call that we got to, and you can see the evacuation hospital in the background, to get fire-based camp evacuated. A third of the soldiers in that fire-based camp, a third, 30 of them out of 100, were so dehydrated they were near death. So we had to get them out quickly and back to be rehydrated and stabilized and treated. So here are the helicopters taking off. I'm going to be in one of these. Next slide. So you go to the fire-based camp, you go over a corridor from Long Bin, from this base, to the fire-based camp. The fire-based camp is in a remote area in Phu Minh, this one. There's a gunner in every helicopter. And you go over this corridor, and they shoot at anything that moves below them in this corridor. They're not going to, they see any movement, they shoot down at it. Next slide. Here's a picture of territory we went over. This is saturation bombing from B-52. You can see the pockmarked landscape. It was very, very common in Vietnam at the time. Next slide. And here's a fire-based camp. So a fire-based camp generally has 500 people in it, but only 100 at a time. And the other 400 are rotating in the jungle around the fire-based camp for miles beyond, probably 50 miles beyond in a diameter. But there are 100 people in the fire-based camp, and that's regarded as rest and relaxation for 5 days or so until the next group came in and they rotated out. Everything works underground in the fire-based camp. It's all bunkered. Please, next slide. So here's what it looks like if you're on the surface. Everything's bunkered, everything goes on underground, and that's for the rest and relaxation of the soldiers who've just been, out circulating in the jungle and under great danger there. And danger here too, because rockets constantly come in. That's why everything is bunkered. Is bunkered and everybody was underground. And here's one of the docs who's a real hero. He lives in this fire-based camp for 6 months. He's the only doctor, and he's the one that has to do all the triage, has to take care of every problem that comes in these 500 men. It's a real amazing task. we had. I could fly in and out and take people in and out, but he's here. Next slide. And here's from looking out from the inside of one of those bunkered areas. Slide, please. So, one of the things that I think you've gotten a flavor of is that we all tried to do something positive when we were there. The four of us adopts at that 28th Remembrance Unit adopted 2 orphanages, one a Buddhist orphanage and one a Catholic orphanage. And we went back to these orphanages on a weekly basis. It wasn't just a one-off thing, but we actually had follow-up and treatment and so forth for these kids. This is a little very malnourished kid with protein malnutrition. You can see his belly, his swollen wrists, and so forth, and also his head being shaved because of lice. Next slide. That's me. This baby had typhoid. Next slide, please. This child had meningitis. I'm doing a spinal tap here. Treatment. Next slide. And one of the big things we could do positively was to immunize children. And this, I'm getting an immunization against tuberculosis, which is, just endemic in Vietnam at the time. So I think the soldiers and the docs and so forth over here, always been seen by Ron and others that have talked here, that tried to do something positive for the people that we, many of us were young fathers and identified with these kids because of our own kids. Next slide. So the aftermath. They mentioned over 58,000 people killed. I wanted to talk for a few minutes about the home front reaction here in Gloucester. I went through the newspapers, the Gloucester Times, from 1965 to 1972. And I'll just go through the years briefly, not everything that happened. In 1965, 1966, there was definitely a pro-war slant in the Gloucester Times, and the protests were regarded as hippie-inspired and dismissed as such. In 1967, 1968 was the years of the Tet Offensive, particularly 1968. And for the first time, there were some profiles of young draft resistors from Gloucester and Rockport that were positive, why they were resisting. Gloucester High School had a band for the salute, but the one student was kicked out of the band because he refused to play a song called The Ballad of the Green Beret, which I actually don't know the song. That was reported. Paris talks began at that time after the Tet Offensive, 1969. Certainly the college student protests began, particularly in Boston, Harvard and MIT particularly. There was compulsory ROTC at Gloucester High School, and that was debated. There were moratorium marches at the Fisherman's Memorial that began in 1969. Gloucester High School students voted 20% for immediate withdrawal from Vietnam, 40% for withdrawal within 6 months. Then it became the Hammer Hill Battle, which was well reported on. And there were tremendous disruptive college demonstrations in Boston and Cambridge and elsewhere in the state. There were huge anti-war demonstrations that began in New York and in Washington. In 1970, the My Lai massacre was reported for the first time in the media, even though it had happened almost a year previously. There was a moratorium march in Boston, including which attracted 70,000 people. There was a riot in Harvard Square of students. Cambodia was invaded, and then the Kent State student shootings happened in May of 1970. There were peace vigils at Grand Circle. Most colleges and universities in New England went on strike In December, war deaths among U.S. troops totaled 43,000. You know, that ended up with 58,000, but including 9 deaths at that time of Gloucester men. And the Frank Przeski Square was named at the corner of Leonard Street and Washington Streets, and you can see the sign there when you go by. In 1971, there were busloads of concerned Gloucester citizens to attend demonstrations in D.C., and Vietnam veterans against the war returned their medals in a very public way as symbols of shame and so forth. In 1972, American engagement now largely was through bombings. Protests continue, and the Army, as we heard, deactivates the last combat unit in Vietnam, so this is the 50th anniversary, please. Personal aftermath. I went back to the training that I was halfway through. I was at University of Chicago hospitals. I was met with polite colleagues, cold to me, curious but never asked a question. I had really no one to talk to about experiences except my family and a few friends, very few very close friends. And that's pretty much why I shut up about it. And I haven't, this is the first time I've actually talked about Vietnam since I came back, except to my family and a few close friends. Please. So this is the good part of it all, coming back. This is my toddler daughter, and at the time, and I also had a little baby. We had a baby when I was away, and he was here tonight. And this was just a catharsis for me and a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful time. They made it all, the other parts of it go away, the coldness, the politeness, and so forth, cold politeness. I'm sorry. We tried every way we could to identify all Anasquam soldiers who were in Vietnam. And we did it through the veterans organizations, we did it to talking to people in Anasquam, and we did it by sending out notices for people to self-identify. We have probably missed a few, and we're sorry we have done that, but we really tried hard to include everyone. And I just want to briefly read the names. David Babson, U.S. Army; Ron Beck, U.S. Coast Guard; Herman Brookfield, U.S. Air Force; John Brock, U.S. Marine; George Craig, U.S. Air Force; Bob Griffith, U.S. Army; Wayne Hodges, U.S. Army; Charles Heberly, U.S. Army; Peter Lawrence, U.S. Navy; David Meacham, U.S. Coast Guard; John Meacham, U.S. Navy; myself, U.S. Army; Russ Smith, U.S. Coast Guard; Richard White, U.S. Army; and Robert Williams, U.S. Marine. So, with those names, I want us to remember them all and thank you from the bottom of our hearts.